I'm Averie.
And I'm Mel.
This is the Veda Lounge podcast.
All things Vedic, cosmic, and magic.
For yoga teachers, entrepreneurs, creatives, and coming back to your own center.
We explore themes on living like you practice to knowing your nature.
Join the conversation for an embodied homecoming to illuminate your radiance.
Through getting nerdy with Vedic sciences and self-discovery, cozy into your cosmic cadence. Welcome back to the Veda Lounge podcast. It's Mel here.
And Averie, hello.
So Averie and I were talking about something to share that for me has been a huge catalyst to really support and collaborate with inspiration in my life. And I want to start with just sharing a story. And I don't know if Averie, you even know this story, but where the prompt of creating your Brave Bank came from. And what a Brave Bank is, it's basically this mental bank or place in your mind of like the people that have really inspired you and represent inspiration. And I learned about this when it was, I think in 2017, when I went and saw Brene Brown. And it was crazy because one of my clients invited me to go because I was a huge Brene Brown fan, especially in like 2014 to, during that time frame. So when I had the opportunity to go and see her as her book, Braving the Wilderness, was coming out, I went to Austin and it was just so good. And if you've read Braving the Wilderness, it's all about duality, holding both, that we belong nowhere and everywhere, and overcoming an unconscious tendency to dehumanize people and the division. It's all about coming into unionship with our uniqueness. And it reminded me a lot of how we step out into the world and the vulnerability that is. But what she talked about was she told a story, and I know I'm not gonna get this perfectly accurate, so I'm not even gonna tell her story, but it had to do with how Oprah was in her Brave Bank. And then how in time, how wild it was the first time she got to meet Oprah and all this stuff. But this concept of doing it for the brave. So you do it for the people who keep you brave. And who's in your Brave Bank? At the time, my thought was, okay, who's in my Brave Bank is going to be, people who have these courageous stories. But over the years, it's these archetypes in a way, like things that model and reflect back my bigness, my higher self, ways to remember who I am at my heart, to the becoming that I want to connect into in that season or that next chapter. So the Brave Bank concept has really stuck with me. And for those who train with us on the Monday with Mel emails that we send out, we always do prompts or something for the spirit to connect to ourselves. And sometimes I will throw the Brave Bank prompt into that. So some of y'all might be familiar with this, but I told Averie, I was like, we should talk about Brave Banks.
Immediately, I was like, yes. And then I was like, oh, because we think about it, we're like, oh, that's an easy question. Who inspires me? But you sit with it and you're like, oh, wait, but who really does inspire me? Because right off the bat, I mean, like I told Mel, I'm like, I struggled. I was like, I'm going to have to report back and be like, I didn't understand the assignment. This is all wrong. And because immediately I'm like, ding, 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 who inspires me? Who are these like head figures? And like Mel said, it's not often these people that come and have these courageous, huge stories, or they're these moguls or these millionaires or these people who have managed to just do everything and get everything right, so to speak. But she's right. It oftentimes is the person who was something for you when you needed that exact thing. Then I was like, okay, I'm going to think about this on a bit different level, but I'm super excited to share with you guys some of these because I think a lot of these actually really surprised me. And I don't know, Mel, do some of yours like actually surprise you when you're like, oh yeah, like that person, when you think back on it, is in my Brave Bank. And at one point was an extreme source of inspiration or was what I needed.
It's interesting, I think, if we walk ourselves back into childhood on like the figures and things that resonated, or we were like, oh, I really admire that. Like for me, I don't know. I always loved, there's some poets, like I love Sylvia Plath and like some of the things learned from her world. And then Audrey Hepburn, right? So I kind of dove into that early on unconsciously. But the more I've learned over the years, even just about those two people, who they were, their journeys, I think that it's something that we take strength from other people's stories. But then also y'all know I love Cleopatra, right? And she kind of was more of like a, not like a, it's different than Audrey Hepburn. She feels like an archetype to me, even though I know she was a real person, which I did find out. Did I tell you about that? Did I talk about this already? Because if I did,
No.
so, and I don't mean to jump all over the place, but this is actually giving perfectly way for me to introduce somebody who's currently, I would say, in my Brave bank. Some of y'all have heard me talk about my poetry teacher, Chelsea Diane. And what she does is she teaches these classes on women in history, but then gives us poetry prompts to connect with them. And I actually started my journey with her when she did a class on Cleopatra, because I love Cleopatra. And what I love is like she was both like this military leader and like this public leader, but also she cared for her people and she took care of her people, and just the bravery and then the intellect that she had with the Library of Alexandria. So there's like all of her stuff that I was so fascinated by. And then Chelsea Diane was doing this poetry thing with her. I'm like, Cleopatra and poetry? Hold on.
What?
And what's crazy is so I've been in her classes, and then this past summer she did one. Oddly, it was when my grandmother passed. I'm telling you, like when Avery said that they find you at the time, like the thing you need at the time you need it. So she happens to be doing a class on the lineage and like our mother lines. And my grandma, like it was so wild because my grandma had just passed away. And so I was really deep in that grief and feeling in that. And then Chelsea's like, we're going to do the lineage with, know your grandmothers, say their names and like all of that. So when I was doing my lineage though, I was like, I wonder what it'd be like to track, like, because I joke that I'm a descendant of Cleopatra. Well, turns out Cleopatra had a daughter who had a son who married a princess who had a son who became the king of Armenia. And the chances of me actually being a descendant of Cleopatra are just as likely as the chances that I'm not. But it would make a lot of sense if, with the kingdom of Armenia at that time, that potentially long down my bloodline, that I am a descendant of Cleopatra. So even though she felt like this archetype character or cartoon character in my childhood, right? Like the becoming of like really relating to the human and the stories and the strength that can bring us. So long-winded fun fact, but that y'all just watched like the modeling of what Brave Banks can do for you and what they can activate in you.
I find it so beautiful, like how you call back to they find you when you need them. And like your poetry teacher, right? It was like this, it wasn't, the workshop wasn't crafted for you, right? It wasn't like she's like, Mel needs this now. And but it's what finds you in that time. And I love that you call back to childhood, and it's something that's always been close to you. And I am going to apologize because I feel like we are going to jump everywhere today, because I think so many of these people and figures that are in our Brave Banks are also so different, because I think that becomes really normal. Because we're pulling constantly, right? The different energies and the different things that inspire us. Because I think what happens is we end up embodying a lot of these things. Not only do we do it for the people in our Brave Bank, do it for the people that keep us brave, but I also think we take on, right, a lot of these qualities that we not cling to, but that we pull to us through these individuals and through their inspiration. So like it's so funny. And I was going to say this for last, but when I was really going through this and really trying to figure out like, okay, who really is in my Brave Bank? Like who would at this moment, like who would I say? And so many things came to mind, and I just shared with Mel that for me, a lot of it ends up being like fictional characters. I think that's just I'm like a lover of literature and stories and things like that, and so I gravitate, like I find a lot of meaning in those things. But the biggest one, I can't, and I kid you not, I kept coming back to was Lizzie McGuire. I'm Lizzie McGuire has been in my Brave Bank since I was 10 years old. I think it's like 20 years since that series started. And so I'm like, but why? And I kid you not, when I thought of her, it wasn't like, oh, Lizzie McGuire, and this is why. I had to sit with it. I had to reflect, because this is something I haven't watched the series in years and years and years and years. But when I sat and I journaled on it and I did some reflection, I'm like, oh, this was the first individual, right? How old were we, Mel? 10 years old when Liz McGuire came out, 10,
Yeah.
11,
Yeah.
middle school, which is just like traditionally such a tumultuous time for a young person just in general. But I'm like, holy crap. The first time that I was met with a character who was truly authentic and truly themselves was Lizzie McGuire. And in the moments like of my growing up and figuring out who I was and who I wanted to be, it was really like I always called back to her. She dressed how she wanted to dress. You look back now, she's like kooky and weird, and like she's entirely okay with it. She wasn't popular. She wasn't super smart. She liked to hang out with her mom. Like all of the things that they tell you as a young teenage girl, like you shouldn't be those things. And she was the first like archetype of my life who really was like, you can step into exactly who you are and it's totally fine. And so I was like inspired. I like went back and watched like the first episode and I was like, oh my gosh. And I tell you, if you have not watched Lizzie McGuire as an adult, you are missing out on something truly so special. But I digress. And it was like, it really brought up so much. So, like I said, it might take a while for these things to come to you, but I would be a fool and be lying if I said that like I didn't still pull inspiration from her and like learning how to be who I wanted to be and being free to express that as well.
Well, I think that when you talk about who we're resonating with and that magnetism, part of it is it's meant to help us remember. I really think
Mhm.
that some things arrive on our path at the timing it does to bring that remembering of who we are and grow us closer to ourselves again. And a lot of times when we have that moment where we go, oh, I wish I was like that, or I want my life like that, we're missing the great teaching that's arriving. You know, like that's so funny. You say Lizzie McGuire. I love Lizzie McGuire. Or I used to love Lizzie McGuire. But you know, an example of like it's easy with, for example, Cleopatra to go, oh well, she was like the ruler of a nation. Like, of course you like her. But it's deeper. Like the courage. Like literally, her family like threw her or her brother essentially like they forbidded her from the kingdom, and the way she got in, she came in a rolled up carpet. Like that's how she reclaimed her kingdom. Her story of how she got back and came through the doors literally like rolled up in a carpet. Like it's the courage to just like be so relentless with the right way, like knowing that I got to do this to rescue my people from this problem, right? Or whatever it is. But it's like these deeper rememberings of courage. And just like with Lizzie McGuire, like, and even like her little, I just think of her little cartoon character, right?
You're gonna die. I literally, there's a sticker on the back of my computer and it's her little cartoon character. It's so sweet. And so I'm like, oh, this just like makes so much sense. This is all full circle. But you're right. It is like when somebody like Cleopatra, where like you're pulling in that courage and that's what's inspiring you. For me and Lizzie McGuire, right? I'm pulling in that authenticity and that permission to be myself. And right, so it's these things and these traits, right, that keep us brave. It's so sweet. And
This her little cartoon thing used to just like be what's on her mind, right? Like it was like her,
yes.
yeah, and like that it's normal for our minds to have these doubts or these feelings,
Mhm.
right? No, that's so awesome. And I think the reason this is so important is that It's a way for us to alchemize and digest the impressions we see in Vedic tradition. And this is kind of where it ties into the yoga, because maybe some are listening, they're like, how in the world does this relate to yoga? Well, they used a lot of the archetypal stories to teach lessons, and it's a lot of people don't realize with asanas, yes, it's cool to be in triangle pose or it's cool to be in these shapes, but there's a deeper lesson derived from the mythology of what that pose represents. Like there's an entire story that helps us understand what are we learning in the development to access that shape. And I think that it's the underneath part when we look at why are we doing what we're doing, and that there's a process like to, let's just say somebody else who's in my Brave Bank. I love Maya Angelou. I love her work, her story, and she's also a manifester like us. But the thing is just like it wasn't easy. Like a lot of these names that maybe exist in the field, right? It's like there is like this story of deep courage, and it can often be eclipsed by the projection that it just happened for them. And I think as people on our own journeys, that it's actually the contrast that is the wild component of the story. Like if your life was made a documentary, right? It's not going to be like, oh, it just happened for that person. Beautiful. It's never like that when it comes to arriving into a beingness or our becoming. Like there is crazy drama, edges, all the unexpected that actually create this beautiful story that led this person to continue to show up in a brave way.
If you had somebody in your Brave Bank, maybe that, because I think we get, like I said, it can get real easy and we're like, oh, we think big. We think we're like, who are the big? Who is somebody that maybe we don't know, right? That maybe we've never heard the name that like exists. Because I think it's so important. I think this also really can show us what an impact what we can really have on other people, and we might not ever know it.
You know, as far as my path and my career, somebody who really awakened permission in me early on was, some people might know who this is, maybe
Mhm.
not, but I followed her on Instagram. Her name is B Bosnock, and I found her in 2012, 2013. And it was the first time I started seeing like sequences more with that meditative flow immersion. And she was, posting these sequences and the way she would blend like quotes. And it really gave me this permission, because a lot of, I think, especially at the time, it was almost like you either teach restorative or you teach yin or you teach vinyasa, or like it wasn't this poetic, like she brought in the poetry without even saying that. And so she was somebody that I really cherished as like a place to calibrate with on social media, that helped me stay true to the artistry or like the craft that I was creating in myself. Yeah, to like be wild a little bit with what I wanted to teach. It didn't have to be so cookie cutter. So a lot of the creative sequencing, I would say she was somebody who planted a seed. I don't think I've ever talked to her. She probably doesn't even know I exist. But great example of like, her impression early on my journey it was huge. It was so big for me.
Well, that, and I mean, how you said you've never spoken to her. She doesn't know these things, but it's the impression, right, that somebody has left with you. And what I think is so beautiful and so key about that, especially as teachers, is because we don't really ever know, right, the full impact that we have, but just, even for somebody to hear that probably would be like, oh, how sweet and how profound. Right. But it's such a key thing where I always say, I'm like, and I love that you use the example of a teacher, because I think as teachers and as yoga teachers, we're oftentimes a collection, right, of the best in which we see and what resonates with us so beautifully.
Yeah,
And
for
so
sure.
I like, and the social media aspect, I think is huge. I think it's such a place for inspiration. I think it's a few other things as well, but right. But it's like, it's so true.
If we're intentional with social media, I mean, this is that the Paitara practices and the Saucha practices around being intentional what we're consuming. Because, and I'm really strict on this for myself around what's on my feed, what I'm being exposed to, because it can create static in how we feel, or it can really energize us. And the example even of, me following Bebo Snock and her impacting me early on in my path, that's the kind of stuff that keeps me brave to just keep showing up on social media anyways for different things, because I don't know, maybe I'm that for someone who will never ever talk to me, or maybe there's just one little thing that is said or done. And I think that the big lesson, and this is kind of a Saturn lesson to be honest, is that you do the work not for the outcome, not
Mm-hmm.
for the work is not about you, it's about how it fits into the Aquarius, the collective, right? And how your just one little light, that flame can travel. You might never ever see it, but it's part of our duty in a way, like for the collective to share our gifts and our magic, because we just never know. And it's not even about what we perceive, but we're doing it for the craft. We do it for the sake of service.
What's so interesting, I love that you mentioned Saturn and how, right, it's a very Saturn lesson. But what is so cool is that we're in between Saturn periods right now. And so we talk about this a lot where we're like, maybe, right? Because Saturn cap is like structure and working your way to the top and the age of the social media influencer and all this. And so we're like, but we're still going to be shifting into another period of Saturn. So it's like, I don't think that that's going to go away because, right, it is Aquarius is collective, but I'm interested to see how it shifts. And I think we've already started to seen it morph a little bit and change. And
Well, I think what the shift is it's not so much about who you are anymore versus like what you contribute, right? The
Mhm.
value you actually bring, and not about just getting to the top or being the one. It's about being a key player in the collective to support. Like it's not that hierarchy. I know we've talked about that in other episodes, and that's what makes me think too when we look at our brave banks of people. I mentioned her in the beginning, but another one for me is Audrey Hepburn. And again, I got to thank Chelsea Diane, because this woman, who my poetry teacher, like does these classes, and I think I know a lot about someone, and then I take a class with her, and she did Audrey Hepburn in January, and turns out I have the same sun, moon, and rising as Audrey Hepburn. So, and apparently her personality would probably be very much like mine. Which I think is so cool. But the reason I bring her up with the Aquarian stuff is because talk about someone who gave a lot to humanitarian, right? Like I keep her in mind. Like she did. I mean, during World War II, right? She was performing and saving money to help give to these families because of the food crisis happening. And she was a young girl performing and dancing and doing things like that. And then when she did get her fame and she became so big, I mean, she was feeding children in Africa and doing all this humanitarian work and really put in her that mission. And those types of things, like that's like you'll forget names of people who whatever, but the legacy impact of really, again, being on a mission, it just inspires me so much. And like what those efforts had did, and who knows who else that inspired to give back. And even I think getting Congress involved and things like that in these humanitarian efforts, she played a role in that. So she's another one in my brave bank. So
That's so interesting. I know nothing about Aubrey. Oh my God. Say it three times fast. Audrey Hepburn.
well, but this is where when we get curious about these names we hear and these people and what we're actually, and I think too, if you don't resonate, there's a reason, and it's okay. Like who you resonate to. I think there's something really beautiful about that.
Oh, absolutely. It's really, I love that you talk about because I think when we mention all these people, and we'll use you as an example, all of these individuals within your Brave Bank make up very different archetypes as well. And so when we look for inspiration, I think it's important to call back that it's probably not all going to come from the same place.
No, not at all.
Yeah.
Who's another do you have another one from your Brave Bank?
Yeah. So when I was going through this, it's really interesting. Like I said, I was really drawn to literary figures in the beginning, or characters, or these, because I think those represent the ultimate archetype sometimes, because they're humans creating humans in a sense. But I was really drawn, if we want to call back to social media, there's a girl named Christine Rodriguez, and she's a Vedic astrologer. And she's so potent in her delivery. And when I tell you that, like, I think social media sometimes can get really oversaturated, and it feels very chat GPT sometimes. And it's just like, it's so much. And the way that Christine delivers, it's not frilly. It's not for the purpose of like looking cute or having like the right aesthetic. She simply is delivering truths, and it's so beautiful. And it was something that was so refreshing, because again, it was a piece of, you can show up just as who you are, and it's entirely fine if you're delivering your truth,
Yeah.
right? So if you don't, again, I've never spoken to Christine Rodriguez, but a wonderful, wonderful example, right, of somebody who, like, she speaks and it resonates. She has, if you listen to her, I'd be so curious if you have the same response, but very strong, like Rahu influence that I can just feel. And it feels good to me. But I'm also, right, I seek that balance between Ketu and Rahu right now. So like, it's probably cosmic resonance. But another one of those examples, right, where she just speaks to something. And especially in a time where I was learning so much about astrology, I was seeking astrology that felt good and real and truthful. She also speaks a lot, just on like current affairs and the state of the world, and a lot of the illusion, that is surrounding us. And she's very truthful and forthcoming. Um, and she's relentless, right, in speaking what she thinks and what she feels. And it's not to like make anybody else feel comfortable or warm or cozy, right? It's very Rahu. It's like, here.
No, I love that. And I think that it's, again, those, when you talked about different seasons, because sometimes I think we can have someone in our Brave Bank and then we just don't resonate anymore, right? Like that can happen
Mm.
too with things. And that's why, like, paying attention to, like, who am I drawn to on social media right now? Like, I'm manifesting that we're going to have Gala Darling, who is my tapping teacher, like the EFT stuff,
Mm.
on the podcast. She's the one on my Brave Bank too, but I've really resonated with her in recent, and it's like we have these different, like, I guess the way I want to say this is that if you're curious or you're feeling called to something, to pay attention. Another example of this is, for years, I could care less about these dumb superhero movies. I hate the violence. I don't like it. Da da da. But I don't know what happened. I think it was when I started really getting into some meditations and into like astral travel and just some things I started dipping my toes into in 2020. But I felt this pull to start watching all the Avenger movies, and I became obsessed with Marvel. Like, and honestly, we're dealing with this week is the 1 year since the docu-series. And the intro video, this is like a cute thing most people don't know. But the intro video, if you watch it, and then the outro video with the Mel Marie logo, I had the designer do it like Marvel does it. So like with the pages, and then the big moving out and then in with
Yeah.
all the, yeah. So if you catch it, you'll see it. But I am so inspired by Marvel to this day, and especially Doctor Strange. Like,
Mm.
he's somebody in my Brave Bank is Doctor Strange, because he had to open his mind, like how humbling his being a surgeon and then losing that. I know it's just a movie, but truly, like, that process, and then him having to work with his energy, and just, I don't know, that I could watch that movie over and over, and just it makes me so excited about physics. It makes me so excited about just being like the magic and what's within us. And I know that as people listen to this, or if somebody loves Marvel and is like, it's just fictional, I'm somebody who is very open to the possibilities of what physics actually does. And I think they do put a lot of this stuff in our face, but it's like there's other dimensions. Like there's so much to that conversation. So yeah, Marvel keeps me brave.
I love that. I love that. I I've seen every Marvel movie, and it was more of like a my husband and I were like, we're just gonna sit down and watch every movie in order. Gives us something like bang it out. And it was so wonderful. I can't say that I've like gone back for more, but it was a great journey to be on.
They are just so creative, and so even just the way they did it, and because of the multiverse, which that's a whole other podcast episode to genuinely talk about, not in Marvel terms, but in science, it's very fascinating. But the way they did that, where now there's like infinite possibilities of stories and how they can branch it, I mean, it is just, they're truly genius. But then also the art of Stan Lee and the way they thread him in. I mean, just it's art, and I think that if when we see and we're exposed to those things, what it does for me is I go, well, how can I really be artful, like be so intentional with what I'm doing that it's like one thing opens, like there's always all these doors that it can open into, or that there's deep, like a lot of people who are in training will probably won't even notice a lot of these things, but there's like deep-seated intention with how I structure my school and like what I teach. A lot of it's inspired by like the permission of people being so deep, or the way they connect these dots, you know?
Now you have me thinking. Now I'm like, wait, hold on. How can I draw this back? How does she do this? But I think like what you say too, when you talk about like, that people will call it out and be like, well, Mel, that's fiction. I think there's such power in stories.
Mm-hmm.
And when I say like it's humans creating humans, because they know that's what other humans need. Like, so it's like, as much as I always call back to like the storyteller, right? It's like, if you feel inspired by a story, I always go read about the author. And that's always, I think that's something I've done recently, just because I get really curious, because I am like, in order to come up with this character, this storyline, this inspiration, you have to hold something really special and powerful within you as well, right? As an author.
Well, I
Yeah.
think that all of us hold that, right? It's just our listening, like, and the way that it is. Like, it's not going to be. I go back to the concept. I've said it in another episode, that if the path is clear, it's not your path. Like, oftentimes we get these ideas and we're like, oh, it's weird. Like, I needed B. Bosnock to go, you know what? I can be really creative and playful in my sequence. Even if there's no name for this asana, it's still an asana. I'm going to do this shape because it feels good, or add these things. Like when we have these examples, sometimes that's actually the push to say, go do it, you know? And I think sometimes we need those pushes, because I know for myself, a lot of times I won't move unless I get uncomfortable, or unless I feel this like boom, like that's reminding me of this, or permission. Like, even we just had this season, my daughter's now starting to get over the Harry Potter stuff, which is, I'm not ready for it, but being in a season where Harry Potter was so big in our lives, what it did to me was I thought I really started to deepen into how I show up. This is gonna sound so corny, but like as a headmaster at my school, like what do I want to create, right? And thinking about the magic, and that's when like Memory Library came, right? Like it actually inspired even more to what I was already doing. And I think that's what the gift of these stories, or these like movies and these inspirations, is that you are the active ingredient. So the moment Harry Potter mixes with you, it's going to be this. When the moment Harry Potter mixes with this other person, it's going to be different. So like whether it's books, fiction, etc., we are the active ingredient, and listening to what things inspire or calibrate in us, because it could be a doorway, it could be an opening, or it could just bring us back to more genuinity.
Oh, I love that you say like we're the ingredient when we mix with something, because it's so true that you're never gonna, I think like we're never gonna resonate with something the same as somebody else. But what I also think is so divine is that we're never gonna resonate with anything the way that we're resonating with it today.
Mm-hmm.
And I think this is really powerful in revisiting. So when we talk about these stories and where, how they hold great power and how we really are, I like to think we're creating, right? With everything that we're consuming, like just like when we eat food, we're creating energy. When we're consuming books and television, it's and social media, we're constantly creating with the things that we're consuming. And it's so interesting because I would love to know if we revisit, right? I know it's not going to be the same, but like what has grown, right?
Yeah.
What has grown, what has morphed.
Well, sometimes we may go back and go, why was I ever into that? But going
Right.
back to it was the perfect thing at the time. And then I think in some cases we can dig even deeper and collect even more realization in ourselves. This is why I love poetry so much. And I mean, a lot of y'all know I would be writing if I just could make a living just writing my poetry all day. Like I love it's so it stirs something in everybody different. It also, when you go back and reconnect with a poem or literary work from somebody, it's going to be different based off of the elements and the variables that are within you in that season, in that now moment. So, I mean, I think that's just proof that we're living art. Like life, we are the poem. Like life is a canvas.
What would be so fun to see, and I think really telling as you're talking and thinking about this, is if we go back, right, to as long as we can remember, and maybe I'm probably going to do this when we get off of this call because I've just been inspired. But if we go back far enough back, as far back as we remember to present day, if we take the time and we sit with it, and we might not remember all of them, but if we think who was in my brave bank at this point, and thematically, I think it can tell us a lot, right, about who we were at the time,
Mm-hmm.
what we were learning, what we were growing through. And I think it can be this really beautiful thing to even just keep that list, right? And revisit those. Like how I tell you, I went back and watched the first episode of Lizzie McGuire. And yeah, it didn't hit the same as when I was 11. It's because I don't maybe need her as much now, but as a way to revisit, right? Maybe who I was back then and sit with that version of me a little bit. And something I've shared with you before, another big one for me was the book Stargirl.
Oh, yeah.
And she was right. It was again around the same. I probably was a little bit older, but still really struggling with the permission to show up and be myself, to know who I was, right? Thematically, that was really huge for me at the time. So when we go back and we look at the people who meant the most to us and the characters that meant the most to us, it probably is really telling, right, of our evolution at the time. And so, yeah, maybe you revisit one of them. Maybe go sit with them as a practice to just sit with your younger self or a different version of you.
It's such a good practice to honor that version of ourselves.
Mm.
I mean, if you would my like brave bank in high school was, you know, I don't know. I don't even know if I want to say, but I was really into like dark screamo bands and all that. And then Sylvia Plath was like, but the problem was, is that the way I was in relationship with Sylvia Plath at that time was it was glamorizing mental health challenges in a way to me. Like I kind of
Mm.
used it as a tool for self-loathing where today, I see this part, I see this strength and courage, but then like expressed herself so wildly. And the way that she was able to metaphor things and she's the start of confessional poetry, which is my favorite style of writing. And so today I see like that bravery of just being honest and um, direct without being direct, like so direct through the metaphor that it hits so hard, but it's relevant to all different walks. Like that artistry And I appreciate that part of it today because I seek to do that as a yoga teacher, as a yoga therapist, that I can deliver one experience that is just going to permeate so beautifully, uniquely in each individual person. You know, so it's like, it's interesting to talk about go back, but then even just how do we relate to it now? It's such a different relationship.
I'm gonna have to read more Sylvia Plath now.
I have to send you my favorite my favorite poem, and this is so classic, is Lady Lazarus, right? So if
Mm.
anyone's listening, it's just it's powerful. It's powerful. And I think that a lot of these different artists and people who, you know, as I think about different authors I've read, sometimes though there's a lot of the same message out there and a lot of the same or a lot of different places, just the way things are said, it can land so different, you know?
Yeah, well, it's interesting, and what's like how what sits with you is probably entirely different than maybe what's going to sit with me, even if it's the same message. Like, I'll share like Brianna Weiss, love her, writer of not poetry, but poetic prose and storytelling. A lot of same messaging, right? A lot of getting that idea across, just in a different way. And what's so cool about this is I think like as just as an activity, I mean, as we talk about these people in our banks and we really sit with the influence that they have on us, I think we can start to see a lot of those traits within us as well. And then it's interesting because a lot of the people who are closest to us would probably hear these names and these people and go, well, that's a little piece of you.
Yeah.
Right. And so it is so true. Like we're alchemizing with these things and they're just becoming, right, a part of the everyday fabric of who we are
It's so
and
true.
why we do it.
So this makes me think about when you look at the story, for example, of the Bhagavad Gita, right? And in that story, you have Arjuna, who's like, he's in his chariot, he's freaking out if he should run away or go to war and go fight this battle and defend his family. And as he's in the basement of this fear and this trauma and this, I mean, it's either basically go die or run away. And so he's sitting in that space, and Krishna or God comes and they start having this conversation, right? And it's about letting go of attachments and, you know, what really is the meaning of presence in life and not being so attached to the outcome and all of this beautiful stuff. And this is why the Bhagavad Gita is a centric prose for yoga philosophy, because it teaches a lot of the yogic framework. But going back to Brave Banks, right? That story and that journey, you know, when you look at, if somebody was interested in getting into the mythology and the archetypes or the different deities and expressions in yoga, they represent human characteristics. And what I love is that they tell stories not to go, oh, this person, you know, Arjuna's flawed for being afraid, but rather to show us how human it is to be afraid of something like that, right? And it's something that we can relate to. So it's really powerful. Like you see this in yoga philosophy, you see this in Greek mythology, you see this in cartoons and, you know, these movies we love, but we also, I think, can see it like how human it is to navigate these things.
I think when you bring up the example of like the Gita and how we learn through deities, but it's like it's the same thing where we're connecting where it feels resonant and we're connecting right to what we need essentially. And I think a lot of it is intuitive. I don't think we are like, oh, I'm gonna go connect to Lizzie McGuire because I need to. No, it's just a felt thing, right? It's like you didn't pick up Sylvia Plath as a teenager and continue to pick it up into adulthood because you were forcing yourself to or because you needed to. It was because it was just intuitively ingrained in your being, in your nature, in what you needed. But again, I think that speaks to, right, the idea and the concept of we know what we need,
Mm-hmm.
right? And following where we're gravitated is ultimately just like another way to care for ourselves. Obviously, if it's things that are actually taking care of us and taking care of our nervous system and benefiting us,
No, I love that you connect into how to care for ourselves. I think for me at that time, I mean, in my chart, I have Saturn Moon conjunction. So naturally, it's like hard, it can be hard on the mind, right? Or hard on the moon. And Sylvia Plath is very Saturn Moon in a way, right? And I think that it's fascinating when we look at our own nature. Like, if you have a lot of air in you, like, are you connected to things that are grounding you? If you have, if you're into Jyotish or astrology, looking at how these archetypes, mythologies, people, etc., how do they pacify things or remind you? I wouldn't say I love Sylvia Plath, but I wouldn't say she's like who I want to become for obvious reasons if you learn her story. But it's
Yeah.
more of I want to learn from, and I'm going to do it. Like, she keeps me brave because she couldn't, and I will. Like, women of her time didn't have the freedoms that women today do. And like how she had to navigate expressing herself. And this actually even brings into, I love history, and even just the journey of learning so much about the veterans in the past and the women in the past, and like certain people in my own past, like grandparents and so forth, and what they had to navigate, and seeing that with so much compassion and doing it, like going into the Brave Bank. They're sitting there because they couldn't, I can. And because of them, I can. And in honor of them, I can. And thank you for what you gave so I can have. Right? So it's like, I think that's Brave Bank stuff.
Well, and it's the perfect, you using that example, right? Of, you're like, hold on, pump the brakes. Like, I don't want to be Sylvia Plath. It's not about always the need or the desire to necessarily embody this person or become this person or be the certain traits that we seek in them. It becomes about our relationship to that person or to what they embody or to their art. Does that make sense? Because I think that's where the power lies. I don't want to be Lizzie McGuire. I'm dying that this is just the example that keeps coming up. But literally, it's like, it's not that like I want to be this 13-year-old's girl. It's my relationship, right, to what that meant to me
Mm-hmm.
and
Keeps
what
brave.
I needed at the time. Yeah.
Yeah, it's like our brave banks are people and things that keep us brave, keep us walking. Because, you look at these stories, whether you read biographies or you watch a, documentary on someone's journey. The one thing that is universal is that life is not easy. And if it's handed to you, there's probably something awaiting on the other side, right? Like, it's just the balance of that duality, and being able to see stories, see things modeled of the courage. I think about going back to Marvel. I love, like, there's so much courage in some of those experiences or those stories. And a lot of it comes down to the flaw is that they're not getting to know themselves. And the moment they come back home to themselves, remember their power, look at how they can save New York City, right? Or whatever. And like, New York City is like, what does that represent? That's you having the power to save your life and live your life as yours and create an authenticity, right? And then the lessons, It's funny you bring up Disney, because I loved Lizzie McGuire, but I was a That's So Raven person. Like, I loved That's So Raven. And I always use
This
that.
is just so telling of who we are as human beings.
That was my show that I loved to watch. But I use it as an example when I teach about Jyotish and astrology of like, do you remember watching That's a Raven? Because if you don't, what would happen is she'd have a vision and try to stop it from happening, and then what would happen? It would still happen anyways, or it'd happen worse. And I think that it's such a good metaphor to remember that we can't outrun our lessons. We can't just get out of these sticky situations sometimes because our soul needs to go through it for whatever reason, but we are still here. Can I still show up each day? And then maybe you remember, that person that you follow who inspires you, or that, you remember, I don't know, Ronald Weasley with the spiders. He lived through it. He got through it. He didn't want to do it. He cried the whole time, but he lived through the meeting all the big spiders or whatever, like it has to resonate obviously, but we can use these stories and I think we could use them to teach our kids too.
Totally. Mine's not quite old enough yet, where the stories that we're doing learning are still like the no David stories, but it's fine. We'll get there.
But even like the example though through children's books, right? Storybooks, like what
Mm.
these characters, how they can be archetypes. I think it's like a brave bank is literally a living vision board.
Oh, great way to explain it. And it's so funny as you're saying children's book, I would be so curious right now, everybody listening, if you could just remember like one book, one childhood book. And for me, instantly it was Madeline that came up. And that book held such significance for me as a child. Madeline was my brave bank, if we want to call it back further than Liz McGuire, right? But a lot of that is right probably what resonated at the time. If I think back, we won't get into all that, but it's so true.
I think there's something too about seeing things modeled. Like, and this is why in the Yoga Sutras, when he talks about the four keys to peace, that when you see a successful person have delight, like be in delight, because what it's modeling is that anything's possible for you too, right? Or like what is possible. And I think that can be hard sometimes, but also we got to remember that there really is a lot behind people's journeys that we just don't know. When you think about most of these people in history, what we love so much about the people is the journey that it took for them to become who they became.
I think that's our point of resonance, right? That's what we're grasping. That's what we're seeking to feel, and that's what's inspiring us to be brave is their journey to become.
And I think when we look at the also who, because, on this podcast, we're not necessarily talking about the personal people, because there's also, I think, angels that come into our lives as humans, or
Mm.
even just like the obvious thing is my daughter keeps me brave because I want to protect and, give her the best life. So I'm going to show up and do mama bear stuff to make sure of that.
Mm.
But I think that by taking this conversation to the levels deeper, because I think when you just ask someone, well, why do you do what you do? Who do you do it for? What makes you brave? It's easy to respond with, oh, my family, or, my loved ones, or, this community makes me brave. But like getting underneath deeper and deeper into archetypes and like where we resonate about, it goes into what we're developing in ourselves, and that mirror, that it's deep inquiry work.
Well, and like how you say it's easy for us to be like, well, my family keeps me brave, my community, my work, this and that. It's important to remember that while, yes, obviously those things do keep us brave, I think sometimes that becomes not so much about who we are and who we're developing, but maybe our duty to other people.
Mm-hmm.
Right. And so by digging a little deeper, it asks not the question of why do you get up and, go to your job every day, which the obvious answer is because my family needs to eat. Right. Or my kids need to get to school or this and that. That's why I do it. That's why I'm brave. But it goes a little deeper into asking, what are you personally developing that is just for you? Because again, that's another way that we care for ourselves.
No, you're so right about that. And I think that if we look at how we're developing, it's also what we're learning and where we feel called. Like an example, and I would actually go as far as saying that Gabor Mate is in my Brave Bank. I love Gabor Mate, but I learn a lot from him, and I really resonate with a lot of things he teaches, especially about trauma. And I think that what's so amazing about finding these lighthouses of humans or archetypes, so to speak, is because, for example, for me, I have a conviction around yoga for trauma recovery, and it's based in my experience of over a decade working with people and myself through understanding trauma. No, did I go to school to become a licensed behavioral health, etc.? No. But I have sit with a lot of humans one-on-one, and I've been through things myself immensely, and how to work through those things. And for so long, I just feel like with yoga being so oriented towards flourishing health, for example, and it's about our wholeness and this innate wholeness within, and remembering that light, where I feel like a lot of things out there are so oriented towards what's wrong with you, keeping you in these like cycles of something's wrong, always needing to heal. But rather, my conviction is, how do we remember ourselves again? How do we reclaim ourselves again? And what I love about Gabor Mate is he was the first voice where I started hearing, like, the way he's talking about trauma. I'm like, thank goodness, because there's so many, talking heads in the world around like all the things wrong with us. And to hear him explain things in a way that are just, for one, relatable, two, neurobiologically connected, and three, accessible, where we're not staying stuck, but how do we move this because it's a natural human phenomenon? I just adore it. I love it. So, and it keeps me brave to share what my heart says about different modalities from my own scope and my perspective. Because I think, too, as whatever craft you have or work you do in the world, it's easy to be in echo chambers, whether that's anything like political, spiritual, like philosophy, anything that is in third house and ninth house, right? Beliefs, the way we think of things. It's easy to be in echo chambers or like only stick to what feels safe. But when we see other people going, hey, wait, I don't, they're pointing stuff out or they're saying it in a certain way, and you're like, oh, I don't know why we need that permission. I'm actually cringed at myself that I need that permission too, but here we are. I'm telling y'all, I need that permission sometimes. I'm like, I'm scared to fully go there, but then you see these other people start to chime and you're like, that's my tune too.
Right. Well, and I love that you mentioned that you draw this back to, just your conviction in using yoga as trauma recovery, because I think we, as if we really want to dial this down as teachers, right? My conviction is self-expression through yoga. That's why I do yoga. That's what keeps me teaching and coming back, right? Is the freedom and the creativity that students cultivate on their mat.
Mm.
Right. But it's because, right, if I really draw it back and I look at all these people in my Brave bank and what has resonated and what I have learned and where I have developed, right, is learning how to just be myself and to just be cool with it. Like, right. And so like I love that you're like, well, let's draw this back and think about too, because it's not only, I think, that, oh, we're learning from these people or we admire this in them, but it's also really starting to like develop something in us that we are then meant to share.
Mm.
Right.
It's radical permission.
Yeah.
It's like absolute permission. And then on the contrary, it's like advocacy. When we talk about the examples of Sylvia Plath or people in the past who may not have had the freedoms we have today or things like that, or maybe our loved ones who didn't have as easy opportunity for things or so forth, right? Like, or anybody, we can
Yeah.
do it in respect and in honor of, thank you for inspiring this in me. How can I bring this light one step further? And then we're
How
just
can I
all,
carry it on? Yeah.
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 So, oh yeah, no, very good. This is interesting. I don't know. I could probably keep on like with the Brave Bank. I just need to look at my bookshelf, and I'm sure I could start talking more stories. But when we think about just immediately who connects, if anyone's listening, it's what instinctively, like, you don't have to overthink it, but sometimes, and maybe it's certain people that are famous. It could be cartoon characters, it could be animals, it could be loved ones. There's no rules on this, but what are we digesting from the calibration to their story or to their presence? How does that evolve you as a human and grow you on your path and keep you rooted in the thing that keeps you living, like that pulse that keeps you going? So it's so powerful, such a powerful practice.
Absolutely. Again, it becomes, what are we taking? I don't want to say it's less about the person, because the person is probably absolutely wonderful. But when it comes to us, right, It's about the relationship that we're cultivating and what we're developing based on that connection to whatever it is that we've found inspiration or need or desire in.
I love it. Well, thank you so much for sharing. I hope that this was a fun podcast. We do have some guests coming up in weeks to come, and it's been really fun getting to share these parts of us with you guys. So thank you for listening.
And share with us too. I would love, love, love who is in your Brave Bank.
By the way, if you're not following the Veda Lounge podcast on Instagram or Mel
Mm-hmm.
Marie Studio, you can find it on either of those. But tell us who's in your Brave Bank. Let's all inspire each other. I love that idea.
Well, bye, y'all.